Alright, well here's your lesson for this evening. It shouldn't be very long, but the first thing I'd like for you to do is to write down a description of me in as much detail as possible. And I want you to think of what I wore in class today. And we'll share notes tomorrow and see how well you did. But my suspicion is that even though you spent 45 minutes with me today, that you're going to get some of the stuff wrong. So, think about jewelry, think about, I don't know, my hair, anything you can think about, okay? So, just take a couple minutes to do that, and you can pause this until you have completed it, and then we will move on. Just bring your description tomorrow in class. So, one of the things that we need to talk about is, are our senses correct? We talked about how sense means more than sight, but we also need to consider whether or not it is fallible. So, perception is the process of attaining awareness or understanding of sensory information, and it comes from the Latin perception, percepio, which means receiving, collecting, action of taking possession, apprehension with the mind or the senses. So this whole idea of taking something in and turning it into some kind of information based on your senses. Okay, so we have to use our senses. We have to use them. It's impossible not to do so. It's impossible not to use them. Even though they might be fallible, we can't just completely discard them. What I'd like for you to do is pause on this slide as soon as I finish talking. And I want you to write down as many F's as you can find in this sentence. Ready, set, go. Pause. Okay, now you've played it again. And how many F's are there? Well, we can go through and mark them. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think I missed one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 6. And so some of you may have missed those that have the V sound rather than the F sound. And so why do we think that we do this? Is it because of the sound that it makes and you associate the F with the quiet, the soft F rather than the hard V? That's something to think about. Okay, so obviously, other things can influence our perception. And in language, for instance, the pronunciation, for instance, of V versus F will affect our perception. And even something as big as, say, dialect, that also can affect it. In our culture, for instance, we've been taught Roy G. Biv for the colors of the rainbow, but what about other cultures? You know, do you know, are there any other ways that people, that teachers, for instance, might use some kind of mnemonic device to help students remember the colors of the rainbow? In biology, we're not physically able to see ultraviolet light even though it exists, so we can't use ultraviolet in order to perceive something or gain knowledge unless we have special lenses or tools. With experience, we have to consider, for instance, that we typically read black lettering on a white background, and if you flip it, it makes it much harder to read. However, I think now with the use of iPads and Kindles and things like that, that is one of the things that you can do really easily, and it kind of helps sometimes with reading at night. And reason can influence our perception because sometimes we just need to try to look at things a different way. So, do we have the right interpretation of our senses? And so we have to think, how do we know that what we're seeing is what we actually think that we're seeing? And so we also need to consider when we should be. So, in terms of distinguishing appearance from reality, I'm sure that you at some point in time did a little experiment with a pencil or a pen in a glass of water. And so when you look at it from the outside, it looks like it's broken or that it's not this continuous pencil, but surely that can't be the case. So we need to look for confirmation by another sense. We want to avoid confirmation bias and just assume that it's what we think it should be, so we look for another sense. And so what we most often do is try to use our fingers, and so we try to use the sense of touch in order to confirm, in fact, that it is one pencil. So we say if it looks like an apple and it tastes like an apple, it must be an apple. With coherence, we've got the example here about a flying pig. He might realize that this flying pig doesn't fit in with what is normal, and so he'll make a rational decision to realize that his perception was flawed and there was, in fact, not a flying pig. Unless you're at a Pink Floyd concert, and then sometimes they do have flying pigs, like literal flying pigs. I'll tell you about that tomorrow. And then with independent testimony, if you can ask other people what they see and you realize that other people saw a plane crash into a building and you weren't the only one, then you can make the assumption that did in fact. So we need to consider our mental construction of reality. So perception goes far beyond seeing, hearing, or any other sense. It's also what how we take that information in and how we process it. So in a hypothetical situation, if you take this phenomena below and describe how it might be seen through the eyes of the following people, it can kind of change things. So a child dying in poverty would be seen differently by a doctor, an economist, a social worker, and the child's parent. I think these would be great things for us to talk about tomorrow. I do have a think question for you tomorrow for the first thing as well. But clearly they're going to see things differently. The parent is going to see this dying child in a much more emotional way, for example, as the others. A sunset as seen by a religious figure, a physicist, a painter, and a farmer, they're all going to see something different. The farmer's going to see the sun as work. When the sun sets, that means he is unable to work. And then trees seen by a biologist, a logger, an environmentalist, and a Native American. With a Native American, it might be something a little bit more religious or a little bit more important or symbolic, whereas the environmentalist is going to try to save it, a logger is going to try to cut it. And so we can look at all of these different things and look at how our perception, other than just our sight or taste, but how they're affected by other outside factors. So, what we need to consider is, can perception give us knowledge of an ultimate reality? And tomorrow we'll talk about some examples of where it can and maybe cannot. Have a good one.